A fateful night at La Belle Maison. The chandeliers glittered like clusters of stars hanging over tables draped in crisp, white linen at La Belle Maison, the finest restaurant in the city. The gentle clinking of silverware and quiet hum of conversations set an atmosphere of luxury and exclusivity. The restaurant was a destination for the city's elite, a place where only the wealthiest dined, and where every detail was as refined as the clientele. Joanne Carter moved deftly between tables, balancing plates, and carrying herself with an air of calm professionalism. The uniform of La Belle Maison fit her well, a black blouse and long, flowing skirt that gave her a sense of grace amid the restaurant's finery. For Joanne, every shift was a step closer to fulfilling her dream of nursing school. While the work was demanding, the tips and experience were worth it. On this particular evening, as Joanne approached her first table, she glanced toward the far corner. A woman sat with her young son at a table near the window. Dressed in a cream-colored blazer and adorned with fine jewelry, the woman exuded confidence, an air of entitlement, even. Her son, Timothy, appeared quiet, glancing around with wide, curious eyes. Joanne recognized the woman immediately. Aria Montgomery was known for her family's wealth and her own reputation as a socialite who expected the very best. "Good evening," Joanne greeted, her voice warm and polished. "Welcome to La Belle Maison. I'm Joanne, and I'll be serving you tonight." Aria barely looked up from the menu. "We waited 15 minutes for this table," she said, a slight edge to her voice. "Unacceptable for a place like this. I trust the service will make up for the delay." Joanne nodded, maintaining her composure. "I'll do my best, ma'am. May I start you with drinks?" Aria scanned the wine list, sighing in exasperation. "Bring me a glass of the Chateau Margaux. And for my son, sparkling water. No ice." She paused, looking up and giving Joanne a once-over. Her lips twisted into a faint frown. "Actually, is there anyone else available? Perhaps someone more polished?" Joanne held her breath for a moment, biting back her words. "Unfortunately, ma'am, we're fully booked tonight. I'll be your server, but I assure you, I'll provide the best possible service." Aria raised an eyebrow, a look of mild disdain flickering across her face. Her young son, Timothy, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes darting between his mother and Joanne. "Very well," Aria muttered, turning her gaze back to the menu with visible displeasure. The order placed, Joanne returned to the kitchen to prepare their drinks, her mind racing to stay composed. Over her years working at La Belle Maison, she had encountered her share of difficult customers, but Aria's demeanor felt more pointed, more personal. She took a few calming breaths and returned to their table, gracefully placing the wine and water on the table. "Are you ready to order your meals?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. Aria picked up her fork, testing its weight in her hand. "Is this the best silverware you offer? I've never been served with such inferior quality before." Her voice was loud enough for surrounding diners to hear, drawing the curious gazes of a few nearby tables. "I'll check with the kitchen, ma'am, but these are the finest pieces we use," Joanne replied evenly. As she turned to leave, Joanne felt Aria's eyes drilling into her back, her disdain palpable. Behind her, Aria was already muttering to her son in a voice that wasn't quite low enough. "Can you believe they expect us to be served by someone like that?" Aria's voice was sharp and tinged with a contempt that echoed across the room. Timothy's cheeks flushed, and he ducked his head, clearly embarrassed by his mother's words. Joanne felt a pang of sympathy for the boy, but knew better than to intervene. She hurried back to the kitchen, her heart pounding as she repeated Aria's specific requests to the chef. Each time Joanne returned to Aria's table, the complaints grew harsher, Aria's voice louder. At one point, she demanded that Joanne remake her entire salad, claiming it was soggy. Joanne complied without complaint, even though the chef confirmed it had been prepared exactly as ordered. Finally, as she set down the new plate, Aria made her most cutting remark yet. Is it truly impossible to find competent help these days? She said, her gaze icy. If you can't manage simple tasks, you should perhaps find another line of work. Joanne felt heat rise to her cheeks, the humiliation sinking in deeper with each jab. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured more water into Timothy's glass. The boy offered her a silent look of apology, his shoulders slumping with what Joanne guessed was second-hand embarrassment. "Ma'am," Joanne managed, steadying her voice, "if there's anything else I can do to make your evening more enjoyable, please let me know." Arya smirked. "Perhaps I'll ask the manager to find someone better suited for this establishment." Just as Joanne started to respond, Timothy suddenly began coughing, his face growing red. Arya turned to her son, her irritation replaced by fear. "Timothy," she gasped. "What's wrong?" The boy's hands flew to his throat, his eyes wide with panic. It took Joanne only a second to recognize the signs of choking. Without a thought, she sprang into action. "Excuse me, Mom," she said firmly, stepping behind Timothy. "I'm trained to handle this." Arya's eyes widened as she stumbled back, letting Joanne move in. Joanne wrapped her arms around Timothy's small frame and began the Heimlich maneuver, her actions quick and precise. The restaurant fell silent, all eyes on the small boy gasping for breath. With each thrust, Joanne focused, willing herself to stay calm and collected. After a few seconds, which felt like an eternity, a piece of food dislodged from Timothy's throat and landed on the table. He gasped, drawing in precious breaths as Joanne gently patted his back, speaking to him in soothing tones. The color returned to his cheeks, and he looked up at Joanne, relief and gratitude shining in his eyes. Arya, still clutching her chest, stared at Joanne in stunned silence. You saved him," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. For the first time that evening, her arrogance vanished, replaced by a vulnerability Joanne hadn't thought possible. Joanne nodded, stepping back. "It's all part of the training," she replied, her voice even. "I'm studying to be a nurse." Arya's expression shifted, a mix of disbelief and something else, perhaps shame. For a brief moment, she looked as if she wanted to say something more, but then she dropped her gaze, unable to meet Joanne's eyes. The boy whispered a quiet "thank you," his small hand reaching up to grasp Joanne's. Joanne smiled gently, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze before excusing herself to the kitchen. She felt the stares of the other patrons on her as she left, the weight of the evening's events pressing down on her. Once behind the closed doors, Joanne allowed herself a moment to breathe, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline. As she dabbed her dampened face with a cool cloth, the kitchen door creaked open, and Mr. Davidson, the restaurant owner, stepped in. He looked at Joanne, his expression filled with regret. "Joanne," he began softly, "I saw what happened. I apologize. I should have stepped in sooner." He pulled out his wallet, extracting a crisp bill. "I'd like to add this to your pay tonight, as a way of saying thank you." Joanne looked at the money, feeling another pang of humiliation. "Mr. Davidson," she said quietly, "I don't need the money. Respect would mean more." Her voice was calm but resolute. Mr. Davidson looked at her, understanding and respect in his gaze. "You're absolutely right, Joanne. Please, take the rest of the night off. You've been through enough." She nodded, grateful for the offer. Collecting her belongings, she left the restaurant, the night air cooling the remaining heat of anger and frustration within her. The sting of Arya's prejudice lingered, but so did the satisfaction of knowing she'd done the right thing. What Joanne didn't realize as she walked away was that this night had set in motion a series of events she could never have anticipated. This evening, the impact of her compassion, dignity, and bravery would echo far beyond the walls of La Belle Maison. Ripples of regret. The following morning, Joanne awoke to the soft chime of her alarm, the remnants of the previous night's confrontation lingering in her thoughts. She took a deep breath, determined to push the memory aside. Her job at La Belle Maison was a crucial part of her journey toward nursing school, and she couldn't afford to let a single bitter incident derail her focus. Still, Aria's words gnawed at her, the sting of each insult sharpening her resolve to rise above the contempt she had faced. Across town, Aria sat at her marble kitchen island, stirring her coffee absently. Her mind wandered back to the events of the night before, replaying the moment when her son, Timothy, had nearly choked. For all her wealth and influence, in those few terrifying moments, she had been helpless, and it had been that waitress, the very woman she'd scorned, who had saved Timothy's life. Aria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the sense of shame weighing heavier than any luxury she could afford. She prided herself on control, on an air of refinement that set her apart, yet in her arrogance, she had allowed her prejudices to overwhelm her sense of decency. She was embarrassed, not just for her behavior, but for the example she had set for her son. Timothy had seen it all, the haughty comments, the disdain, and the slap. He had looked at her with something close to shame, an expression that haunted her now as she sat alone in her empty house. Unable to shake the discomfort, Aria glanced over at her laptop on the kitchen counter. She reached for it, her fingers hesitating on the trackpad before she finally opened the search bar and typed in La Belle Maison Waitress Nursing School. She barely understood what compelled her to look Joanne up, but something inside her, a nagging feeling of unfinished business, urged her on. After a few minutes of scrolling, she found what she was looking for, an article from a local magazine highlighting people to watch. There, beneath a smiling photo of Joanne, was a brief biography detailing her efforts to support herself through nursing school, her dreams of becoming a nurse, and her passion for helping others. Aria read the article, the weight of Joanne's compassion settling over her. This woman, whom she had dismissed as merely a waitress, was someone of depth and dedication. Aria felt a pang of regret sharper than she could have anticipated. Meanwhile, Joanne sat at her small kitchen table, finishing a breakfast of toast and tea. She'd received an unexpected call that morning from Mr. Davidson, the owner of La Belle Maison. His voice had been warm, tinged with an apology and an offer that took her by surprise. "Joanne, I can't stop thinking about how you handled things last night," he'd said. "I'd like to help with your nursing school fees. It's not much, but consider it my way of making up for not stepping in sooner." Joanne was taken aback, feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. She politely declined his offer, feeling that accepting financial aid from her employer might complicate her working relationship with him. But the call had lifted her spirits, reminding her that, despite Aria's cruelty, there were people who genuinely respected her dedication. Later that afternoon, Joanne returned to La Belle Maison to pick up her pay for the previous night's shift. She had taken the day off, but Mr. Davidson insisted she stop by to talk. As she entered the restaurant, she could feel the usual energy in the air, the smell of freshly baked bread mingling with the soft melodies that played over the speakers, the quiet conversations, and the clinking of glasses. Mr. Davidson greeted her with a warm smile, ushering her to his office where they could talk privately. "Joanne, I want you to know that last night's events are weighing on me," he began. "No one should have to endure what you did, especially in my establishment." Joanne offered a tight smile. "Thank you, Mr. Davidson. It was a difficult situation, but I'm used to dealing with customers like Mrs. Montgomery." "Even so," he said, his tone resolute, "you handled yourself with dignity and professionalism. I've decided that moving forward, I'll be taking a firmer stance against mistreatment of my staff. No customer, no matter their status, has the right to treat you like that." Joanne felt a surge of gratitude. "That means a lot, Mr. Davidson. Thank you." They continued speaking for a few more minutes, and Joanne could tell that he was sincere in his resolve to protect his employees. She left the restaurant feeling a renewed sense of hope, as though a small victory had been won. That same evening, Aria sat down with Timothy, who had been unusually quiet since the night before. She knew she had to talk to him about what had happened at the restaurant, but she struggled to find the words. "Timothy," she began softly, "I want to talk about what happened last night." He looked up at her, his expression guarded. "Why did you act like that, Mom?" Arya hesitated, taken aback by the bluntness of his question. I didn't mean to upset you," she said carefully. "I was just trying to make sure we had the best service." Timothy frowned. "But she wasn't mean to us, Mom. She was nice, even when you were, well, even when you weren't." He looked down at his lap, twisting his fingers. "She helped me when I couldn't breathe." Arya felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to defend herself, to explain her actions, but she knew he was right. Nothing she could say would justify the way she had treated Joan. She reached over, placing a hand on Timothy's shoulder. "You're right, Timothy. I was wrong to treat her that way. Sometimes I make mistakes, just like everyone else." Timothy looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "Do you think you'll say sorry to her?" Arya hesitated. She hadn't considered apologizing, but the idea lingered in her mind. Her pride protested, yet a part of her, a part she hadn't listened to in years, felt that perhaps it was the right thing to do. "I think I might," she said, more to herself than to Timothy. She felt an odd sense of relief at the thought, as if apologizing might be a small way to right the wrong she had committed. The next morning, Arya found herself dialing the number for La Belle Maison. She waited as the phone rang, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. When the hostess answered, Arya requested to speak with Joanne, her voice steadier than she expected. "I'm sorry, but Joan's not in today," the hostess replied. "Can I take a message?" Arya hesitated, unsure of how to explain her request. "Just let her know that Arya Montgomery would like to speak with her. I owe her an apology." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but also liberating. The hostess promised to pass on the message, and Arya hung up, feeling a surprising lightness in her chest. She hadn't apologized to anyone outside of her family in years, and even though Joan hadn't hurt her yet, the act of voicing her regret felt like a first step toward something better. Across town, Joan checked her phone, finding a missed call notification from the restaurant. She saw the note from the hostess, briefly raising an eyebrow at the unexpected message. Arya Montgomery wanted to apologize. Joan considered ignoring it. After all, what difference would an apology make? But something in her urged her to hear Arya out. Maybe, just maybe, Arya had learned something from their encounter. With a deep breath, Joan saved the message. She'd decide later whether or not to respond. An unexpected encounter. As the weekend rolled around, Joan decided to spend her day off at the local library, a small escape she cherished amidst her demanding work and studies. The library offered solace, with its quiet hum of activity and endless rows of books that transported her mind far from the daily grind. Nursing school applications loomed on her horizon, and Joan intended to review her study materials, hoping to maintain her focus on her future. While Joan buried herself in textbooks, Arya Montgomery's weekend was shaping up quite differently. After leaving her message with the restaurant, Arya spent days waiting, each hour making her feel more anxious than the last. She was not accustomed to being the one reaching out, especially not to someone she had once looked down upon. The days that passed since the incident had left her with an increasing unease. Timothy's quiet, lingering looks had reminded her again and again of the disappointment he'd felt watching her mistreat Joan. The shame of her actions weighed heavily on her, a reminder of her thoughtlessness and an arrogance she no longer wished to recognize in herself. By Sunday afternoon, Arya could no longer sit idly by. She dressed, told herself she would run a few errands, and left her home, subconsciously hoping that fate might grant her a chance encounter with Joan. She didn't know how or where, but she had to find her. Arya knew that an apology over the phone would be hollow, and she needed, to express her regret in person. A few blocks away from her house, Arya stopped by a quaint cafe, one she usually avoided for its lack of exclusivity. She entered, ordering a coffee to steady her nerves. As she waited, she glanced around, noticing the small library adjacent to the cafe. It was an unassuming building, but it caught her attention. She had passed it countless times without a second thought, but today something pulled her towards it. Holding her coffee, Aria stepped inside, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of aged books and polished wood. She meandered through the shelves, her mind still on the apology she wished to give. But as she rounded a corner, she froze. There, seated at a small table in a secluded corner, sat Joanne, surrounded by open books and loose papers. For a moment, Aria's first instinct was to turn back, to leave before she was noticed. But a surge of determination overcame her hesitation. She had come here hoping to find her, and here she was. A chance to do what she'd avoided for so long. Take responsibility for her actions. Slowly, Aria approached the table. Joanne didn't notice her at first, deeply engrossed in a thick textbook, her pen moving steadily across her notes. Aria cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Joanne looked up, startled to see Aria standing before her. A hint of confusion crossed her face, followed by a guarded expression. She closed her book, sitting straighter, bracing herself for whatever this unexpected encounter might bring. "Aria," Joanne greeted, her voice polite but devoid of warmth. "Joanne," Aria began, her voice softer than usual, an unfamiliar hesitancy coloring her words. I didn't expect to find you here. I tried calling the restaurant. But..." Joanne nodded, her expression impassive. "Yes, I received your message." She waited, her silence heavy with expectation. Aria felt a lump rise in her throat. All of her carefully rehearsed words, the phrases she'd practiced in her head, scattered like leaves in the wind. She took a deep breath, pressing forward with what she hoped would be enough. "I came here to apologize, Joanne," Aria said, her voice faltering slightly. "I behaved terribly toward you. There's no excuse for the way I treated you at the restaurant." Joanne raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. "And yet you did treat me that way," she replied, her voice steady, but edged with the memory of that evening. Aria winced, nodding. "Yes, I did. And I was wrong. I didn't see you for who you are. I only saw. I don't know what I saw, but it wasn't right. I owe you more than an apology, Joanne. You saved my son's life, and all I did was humiliate you in return." Joanne took a moment, letting Aria's words hang in the air. She hadn't expected to feel any satisfaction in hearing Aria's remorse, but there was something undeniably validating about it. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension she'd unknowingly been holding slip away. "Aria," Joanne began quietly, choosing her words carefully. "I won't pretend that your apology erases what happened, but I appreciate you coming here to tell me this in person." She paused, her expression softening slightly. "I have to ask, why now?" Aria's gaze dropped to her hands, which were tightly gripping her coffee cup. She took a moment before answering, her voice low. "My son, Timothy, he saw everything that night," she admitted, her voice thick with regret. "He saw me act in a way I'm not proud of, and he asked me why I was so cruel. I couldn't give him an answer. I couldn't even justify it to myself." Aria glanced up, her eyes filled with sincerity. "That question, coming from him, changed something in me. I realized that I want to be someone he can look up to, someone who treats people with the respect they deserve. You didn't deserve what I put you through, Joanne." Joanne listened intently, surprised at the honesty in Aria's words. She nodded slowly, digesting the unexpected vulnerability that Aria was showing. "I'm glad Timothy asked you that question," Joanne said. "Maybe it's the first step toward being the mother he needs." She took a breath, searching Aria's face for sincerity. "But you have to understand, Aria, this apology can't just be for my sake. If you're sincere, you'll need to be willing to change, not just with me, but with everyone you encounter." Aria nodded, absorbing Joanne's words. "I know," she replied softly. "I'm committed to doing better." She placed her coffee on the table, a hint of sadness flickering in her gaze. "I want to prove it, to show you that I've learned from this. I understand if you don't trust me yet, but I'd like to try." Joanne watched Aria, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Change isn't easy, Area. But I'm willing to give you a chance to prove that you mean it. Words are a good start, but actions are better. A flicker of relief crossed Aria's face. She nodded, her posture visibly relaxing, though her gaze remained earnest. Thank you, Joanne. I won't let this chance go to waste. For a moment, the two women sat in silence, an unexpected camaraderie forming between them. Joanne returned to her studying, and Aria, with a quiet thank you, departed the library with a sense of relief and determination she hadn't felt in years. She was uncertain of what would come next, but knew that her path forward had to be one of action, not words. As the weeks passed, Aria set small goals for herself, reminders to consider others, and not let her assumptions cloud her judgment. She began volunteering in her community, working with local charities and initiatives focused on supporting single mothers and students pursuing higher education. She felt the challenge of this change, the constant need to reshape her habits, but Timothy's question echoed in her mind whenever she wavered, grounding her in her commitment. Joanne, meanwhile, continued with her routine at La Belle Maison, her nursing school applications ready to be submitted. She felt an odd sense of satisfaction each time Aria's name came up in local news, noting the articles detailing Aria's charitable work and donations. She was skeptical at first, wondering if it was a performance. But over time, Aria's consistency spoke louder than any gesture. Joanne didn't expect Aria to transform overnight, but the small steps gave her a renewed sense of optimism. One evening, as Joanne was closing her shift at the restaurant, Mr. Davidson approached her with an envelope in hand. He gave her a nod, a knowing smile playing on his face. "This came for you, Joanne," he said. "I think you'll find it's worth a look." Curious, Joanne opened the envelope, finding a letter and a check made out to her in a sum that left her speechless. The letter was from Aria, expressing her gratitude and her desire to help Joanne's journey to nursing school. It ended with a sincere offer of support, asking nothing in return but the opportunity to help Joanne pursue her dreams. Joanne looked up at Mr. Davidson, her eyes wide with disbelief. She didn't have to do this. She wanted to, Mr. Davidson replied. "I think it's her way of showing she's serious." Joanne held the check, her heart pounding with a mix of surprise, gratitude, and even forgiveness. She knew that accepting this gesture wasn't just about the money. It was about acknowledging Aria's effort to change and understanding that everyone deserved a chance at redemption. Taking a steady breath, Joanne nodded. She folded the check carefully, her thoughts turning to her future. For the first time, she felt that her dream of becoming a nurse was closer than ever, and she understood that her impact on others, even those who had once looked down on her, had the power to create a ripple far beyond what she had ever imagined. With a quiet smile, she tucked the letter into her bag, her mind already racing with new possibilities. The tides of transformation. Joanne clutched the check from Aria, still grappling with the reality of this unexpected support. The letter accompanying it was a heartfelt acknowledgement of Aria's past mistakes and her commitment to grow from them. But beyond the words, the substantial financial support for her nursing education left Joanne deeply moved. With this help, she could focus less on grueling work hours and more on her studies, hastening her path toward her goal of becoming a nurse. But what struck Joanne most was not the generosity itself. It was Aria's willingness to address her faults in such a meaningful way. This woman who had once wielded her privilege as a weapon was now using it to lift others up. Skepticism still lingered, but Aria's commitment seemed more genuine than Joanne could have imagined. Meanwhile, Aria had found herself in uncharted territory. She had begun volunteering with local organizations, particularly a community center that provided career support and mentorship for single mothers and young students. At first, she had seen it as a way to balance the scales, a way to repay the karmic debt she felt she owed. But as she spent more time there, she began to realize the impact of her own actions, both large and small, on the lives of others. At the community center, Aria met Amanda, a young single mother working tirelessly to earn her GED while supporting her two children. Amanda was confident, resilient, and often expressed dreams of a better life. Aria felt an instant connection with her, admiring the way Amanda approached life with unshakable optimism despite her circumstances. One day, Aria invited Amanda for coffee after a particularly challenging day at the center. As they settled into a booth at a small cafe, Amanda opened up about her struggles and her hopes for her children, her tone brimming with determination. "I want them to know they can do anything," Amanda said, her eyes bright with purpose. "I don't want them to feel limited by where they come from or who they are." Aria nodded, absorbing Amanda's words. She had once taken for granted the power her own background and resources had afforded her, never pausing to consider what life might look like without those privileges. Now, sitting across from Amanda, she saw her own life through a new lens. "You're already teaching them that," Aria said, feeling an admiration that was new to her. "Just by showing up every day, by working so hard. They're lucky to have you." Amanda gave a small smile, her gratitude evident. "Thank you, Aria. I couldn't do it without the support of people at the center." Their conversation stayed with Aria long after she left the cafe. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized that she had spent much of her life blind to the struggles others faced. Her interactions with Joanne had planted a seed of self-awareness, but Amanda's resilience was nourishing that growth. For the first time, Aria found herself wanting not just to atone for her past mistakes, but to truly understand and embrace the responsibility that came with her privilege. Weeks later, as Joanne made her way to her shift at La Belle Maison, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Aria's support had lightened her financial burden considerably, and the extra time she gained allowed her to devote herself fully to her studies. She was excelling in her coursework, moving closer to her dream of becoming a nurse, and the gratitude she felt only deepened her commitment. When Joanne entered the restaurant, Mr. Davidson greeted her with a broad smile. "Joanne," he began, his voice tinged with excitement, "I have some news for you. We've been thinking of ways to improve the restaurant experience, and we believe you'd be perfect to help lead that change. How would you feel about a management position?" Joanne was taken aback. The offer was unexpected, but she knew what it would mean. Beyond the pay raise and responsibility, this promotion would place her in a role of leadership, allowing her to support her colleagues in ways she had always hoped to. She felt a surge of pride, knowing that her hard work and dedication had not gone unnoticed. "It would be an honor," she replied, her voice steady with conviction. "Thank you, Mr. Davidson. I won't let you down." In the days that followed, Joanne adapted to her new role, focusing not only on the patrons, but also on supporting her coworkers, particularly those who faced the same challenges she had when she first started. She remembered the humiliation she'd felt in front of Aria, and she used that experience as motivation to foster a work environment where everyone was treated with respect. She spoke up when patrons treated the staff unfairly, making it clear that La Belle Maison valued its employees and their dignity above all. One evening, as Joanne was finishing her shift, she noticed Aria at a table near the back, speaking to a group of young women from the community center. Amanda was with them, as were several other women whom Joanne recognized from recent articles about Aria's community work. They were laughing, their voices animated, and the energy around the table was warm and inviting. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant Aria Joanne had once known. When their eyes met, Aria gave Joanne a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their journey together. Joanne returned the nod, a faint smile on her face, feeling the weight of mutual understanding pass between them. After her meal, Aria approached Joanne, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice soft yet sincere. "Not just for saving Timothy, but for giving me a chance to do better." Joanne's smile widened. "You've come a long way, Aria. I'm glad to see it." They exchanged a few more words before Aria left, the interaction simple but full of meaning. Joanne felt a warmth settle in her chest, a sense of peace that she hadn't anticipated. She had moved past the resentment, the humiliation, and found herself in a place of genuine forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, Joanne and Aria's paths continued to cross, each of them forging ahead with their own missions. Joanne excelled in her new role, and her application to nursing school was met with an acceptance letter that brought her one step closer to fulfilling her dream. She felt more capable, more self-assured, and more inspired to make a difference. Her experiences with Aria and her time at La Belle Maison had given her a resilience that would guide her as a nurse, a profession that required compassion, strength, and the ability to see beyond the surface. As for Aria, she immersed herself in her community work, dedicating more time to the center and forming genuine connections with the women there. Her transformation was not immediate, nor was it without difficulty. She often found herself facing the remnants of her past attitudes, moments when her old arrogance threatened to resurface. But each time, she reminded herself of the lesson Joanne had taught her, of the grace she had been shown, and the opportunity to grow from her mistakes. One evening, Aria stood before a group at the community center, sharing her story of change and the hard truths she had faced. She spoke of Joanne, of the pivotal moment that had opened her eyes, and of the journey she had taken toward becoming a better person. Amanda and other women from the center listened, moved by Aria's vulnerability and honesty. After the talk, Amanda approached her, smiling warmly. "You're a different person than the one I first met, Aria. I think you're really making a difference here." Aria nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I hope so. Joanne showed me that change is possible, even when you least expect it." As she left the community center that night, Aria felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She understood now that her privilege was not a shield to wield, but a gift to share. And as she walked home, she couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she needed to be. On the day Joanne received her nursing degree, Aria was there to cheer her on, standing alongside Amanda and the other women from the community center. As Joanne took the stage, her heart swelled with gratitude, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had supported her journey. She spotted Aria in the crowd, and their eyes met once again. In that moment, Joanne realized that they had both been transformed, not by the apologies or the grand gestures, but by the quiet, consistent acts of kindness that had followed. Aria's journey had taught her the power of humility, and Joanne's had shown her the strength of forgiveness. Their paths had intertwined, leaving each of them forever changed, and in a way healed. As the ceremony concluded, Aria approached Joanne, and the two women embraced, their hearts full of pride and gratitude for the unexpected bond that had brought them both to this moment. It was a connection built not on shared backgrounds or experiences, but on the courage to forgive and the resilience to grow, a test of strength and compassion. The weeks after Joanne's graduation from nursing school brought a new chapter in her life. She was quickly hired by a prominent hospital in the city, her academic achievements and work experience at La Belle Maison making her a standout candidate. Every morning, she donned her new uniform with pride, feeling the culmination of her years of hard work come to fruition. She felt ready to take on any challenge that came her way, armed with a heart full of purpose and a resolve sharpened by her journey. However, Joanne's resolve was about to be tested in ways she could never have anticipated. It was an early autumn morning, and the hospital was alive with activity. Joanne moved through her rounds, checking on patients, assisting senior nurses, and learning the rhythm of her new role. Her compassion and attentiveness made her a favorite among patients and colleagues alike. She approached each patient with kindness and respect, making them feel seen and heard, a rare quality in the fast-paced hospital environment. Then one day, as she was reviewing patient files at the nurse's station, her attention was drawn to a commotion down the hall. A stretcher was being wheeled in, paramedics flanking a woman who was barely conscious, her face pale and her breathing labored. Joanne felt a jolt of recognition. It was Aria. Joanne's heart skipped a beat as she watched the scene unfold. Aria looked weak, her normally composed and dignified demeanor nowhere to be seen. Her face was flushed, her eyes unfocused as she struggled to keep them open. Joanne immediately approached the paramedics, her mind racing with concern and professionalism. "What happened?" Joanne asked, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "She was found unresponsive at her home," one of the paramedics explained, glancing at Joanne. "We suspect it's a severe allergic reaction. Her breathing was compromised, and she's been in and out of consciousness since we picked her up." Joanne felt a wave of fear wash over her as she looked down at Aria, whose breathing was shallow, her lips tinged with a faint blue. Without hesitation, Joanne took charge, helping to stabilize Aria's breathing with the team and ensuring that she received the necessary medication to counteract the reaction. The moment was intense, but Joanne's training kept her focused, her mind fully engaged in the work before her. As Aria was transferred to a recovery room, Joanne lingered outside, waiting to hear an update from the doctor. She felt a strange blend of emotions. The deep empathy she had cultivated as a nurse, mixed with a personal sense of care and responsibility for Aria. She wasn't just another patient. She was someone who had come to mean something to Joanne, despite their rocky past. Joanne's concern was personal, and she couldn't bring herself to leave until she knew Aria was stable. Several hours later, the doctor emerged, and Joanne immediately approached him. "She's stable now," the doctor informed her, his tone professional but reassuring. "She's regained consciousness, but she's weak. If you'd like, you can go in and check on her." Joanne nodded, feeling a swell of relief. She quietly entered Aria's room, finding her lying in the hospital bed, her eyes closed, but her breathing calm and steady. Aria's face looked softer, devoid of the polished, aloof expression she usually wore. Joanne took a seat by her bedside, waiting patiently for her to wake. After a few moments, Aria's eyes fluttered open, her gaze gradually focusing on Joanne. She looked confused, disoriented, as if trying to piece together where she was and how she had gotten there. When her eyes settled on Joanne, her expression shifted from confusion to surprise, and finally to gratitude. "Joanne." Aria's voice was barely a whisper, her tone laced with vulnerability. What happened?" "You had a severe allergic reaction," Joanne explained gently. "The paramedics brought you in, and we were able to stabilize you. You're going to be okay, but you'll need to rest and let your body recover." Aria took a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. She looked away, her hand trembling slightly as she reached up to touch her face. Joanne noticed, with some surprise, that Aria seemed more fragile than she had ever seen her. This was a woman used to being in control, to maintaining her composure in any situation. Yet here she was, vulnerable and exposed. "Thank you," Aria managed, her voice breaking slightly. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Joanne reached over, placing a reassuring hand on Aria's. "You don't have to thank me, Aria. It's my job to help people, to take care of them when they're at their most vulnerable." Aria's gaze softened, her eyes filled with something that looked remarkably like regret. "I've been so blind, Joanne. I spent so many years seeing only what I wanted to see, treating people like they were beneath me. And yet, here you are, showing me more kindness than I ever deserved." Joanne felt a pang of empathy as she listened to Aria's words. She knew that growth and change were rarely easy. They often required a person to confront parts of themselves they wished to ignore. "You've come a long way," Joanne replied softly. "I think you're learning, Aria. Change doesn't happen all at once. It's a journey, and you're on it." Aria's eyes welled with tears, and she gave a small nod, as if accepting Joanne's words for the truth they held. The two women sat in silence, their connection deepened by the shared understanding of vulnerability, humility, and the power of compassion. The next few days saw Joanne visiting Aria regularly, her visits a source of comfort and companionship for Aria, who had no family close by. Aria's illness had brought forth new perspectives, giving her time to reflect on the relationships and choices she had made. She recognized, perhaps more than ever, how rare and precious true kindness was, especially from someone she had once treated with disdain. Joanne's generosity, her capacity for forgiveness, had impacted Aria more profoundly than any material gift ever could. One afternoon, as Joanne entered Aria's room with a warm smile, Aria reached for her hand, her expression resolute. "Joanne," she began, her voice steady despite the lingering weakness, "I've decided to make some changes in my life. Real changes, not just words." Joanne nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I want to use my resources to support students like you, people with dreams of making a difference. I've been in touch with a foundation that works with nursing scholarships, and I'm starting a fund in your honor, for people who want to serve others the way you do." Joanne's eyes widened in surprise. She felt a surge of pride and gratitude as she listened to Aria's words, knowing how deeply meaningful this gesture was. Aria's transformation had not come easily, nor had it come swiftly, but Joanne could see that it was real. Aria's journey was not about undoing her past, but about moving forward with a newfound sense of responsibility and purpose. "Aria, that's incredible," Joanne replied, her voice full of genuine admiration. "There are so many people who will benefit from this. You're creating something that will make a real difference." Aria's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I owe that to you, Joanne. You showed me a different way to be, a different way to see the world." Joanne took a deep breath, the enormity of the moment settling over her. She had never expected that the kindness she had shown Aria would ripple out in this way, creating a legacy that would support others in the pursuit of their dreams. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion had the potential to create profound change. The two women shared a quiet smile, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken together. They had come full circle, not as adversaries, but as allies. Two women whose lives had been forever altered by a single fateful encounter in a high-end restaurant. In the months that followed, Aria's health improved, and she fully recovered from her allergic reaction. True to her word, she established a nursing scholarship fund in Joanne's honor, and the first recipients of the scholarship were selected later that year. Joanne attended the ceremony, watching with pride as young students received the support they needed to pursue their own dreams of service and care. As Joanne stood by Aria's side, watching the smiling faces of the scholarship recipients, she felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She had not only achieved her own dreams, but had also played a role in inspiring change in someone else, a change that would now go on to impact countless lives. Their friendship grew, a bond built on mutual respect, understanding, and the knowledge that transformation was possible, even for those who had once seemed unyielding. Aria continued her work in the community, dedicating herself to causes that supported education, healthcare, and social equality. She became a mentor to many, sharing her own journey with humility and the hope of inspiring others to confront their own prejudices. Joanne, now a respected nurse, found herself mentoring younger nurses and volunteers, passing on the lessons she had learned about empathy, resilience, and the power of forgiveness. Her story and Aria's story became a powerful example within the community, a testament to the idea that kindness could indeed change the world, one person at a time. And as they stood together, side by side, they knew that their journey was far from over. The tides of life would continue to test them, to challenge their convictions and push them to grow. But they were ready, united by a bond that had transcended the wounds of the past, and guided by the hope of a better, brighter future, for themselves and for the world. A legacy of kindness. Years had passed since that unforgettable encounter in the restaurant, and both Joanne and Aria had undergone transformations deeper than they could have imagined on that fateful night. They were now pillars of their community, though their paths had diverged in remarkable yet complementary ways. Together, they had created something much greater than the sum of their parts, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and justice that had begun to ripple out across the city, reaching countless lives. Joanne was now a seasoned nurse, respected and beloved by her colleagues, patients, and the community alike. Her journey from waitress to nurse had become a source of inspiration to young people facing hardships similar to what she had once endured. She was known for her steady hands and her gentle heart, a nurse who would sit by a patient's side and listen when they needed someone most. Joanne's reputation extended beyond the hospital. She was frequently invited to speak at local schools and community events, where she shared her story, hoping to inspire others to pursue lives of empathy and service. Her story was often shared alongside the story of Aria Montgomery, who had become a well-known philanthropist and community advocate. Aria's Fund for Nursing Scholarships, named after Joanne, had grown significantly over the years, becoming a vital source of support for aspiring nurses and healthcare workers across the state. Aria's public image had also changed drastically. Once seen as a privileged socialite, she was now respected as a compassionate, hands-on community leader who invested in the lives of those society often overlooked. Her journey of personal transformation became widely known, and she openly credited Joanne's kindness as the spark that had ignited her desire to change. On a crisp autumn evening, the city held its annual Voices of Resilience Gala, a prominent event that celebrated individuals and organizations working to uplift their communities. This year, Joanne and Aria were the honored guests, recognized for their contributions to healthcare, education, and social justice. The city's finest attended the gala, alongside beneficiaries of the Scholarship Fund and other community members who had been impacted by their work. The room was grand, decorated with soft lighting and elegant floral arrangements, yet it was filled with a warmth that transcended the opulence. The crowd hushed as Joanne and Aria took the stage, and the event's host introduced them, recounting the journey they had shared. Joanne looked out over the crowd, her heart swelling as she saw faces both familiar and new, former patients, young nurses she had mentored, students whose scholarships had opened doors for them, and even Amanda, the young mother Aria had befriended years ago, now flourishing as a business owner and community advocate herself. When it was Joanne's turn to speak, she paused, taking in the significance of the moment. She felt the weight of all those who had supported her and the responsibility that came with the influence she now wielded. Clearing her throat, she began. Years ago, I was a waitress, and I would have never imagined myself standing on a stage like this. I wanted to become a nurse because I believed that every person deserves compassion and care, no matter where they come from or what they look like. She looked over at Aria, offering a warm smile. Sometimes, life gives us opportunities to make a difference in ways we don't expect. That night in the restaurant, I was only doing what I felt was right. I didn't know it would lead to this incredible friendship or to this fund that now helps young people achieve their dreams. But it's proof that even small actions can create ripples we may never see. The audience applauded, moved by her words. Joanne took a step back, passing the microphone to Aria, who took a steadying breath, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped the mic. I stand before you tonight, humbled by the grace I was shown by Joanne. Aria began, her voice clear yet full of emotion. I thought that wealth and status were measures of a person's worth, but Joanne taught me something far more important. She taught me that our worth is defined by how we treat others. Her kindness held up a mirror to my own prejudices, and it made me realize that I had the power to change. Aria paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. The scholarship fund we started was not just about helping people financially. It was about giving them the dignity and opportunity they deserve. Every one of you here tonight, especially those of you who have been impacted by this fund, is a reminder to me that people can and do change, and that we're all part of a larger community. Our shared humanity is what binds us, and it's a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. The applause that followed was thunderous, the room filled with admiration and respect for the journey these two women had taken, both individually and together. When the applause died down, the host announced a special surprise, unveiling a plaque that commemorated the official naming of the city's new community health care center, the Joanne Carter Center for Community Health. Joanne's eyes widened in shock as she took in the sight. She hadn't known about the center or the name, and for a moment she was speechless. Aria turned to her, a gentle smile on her face, her eyes bright with pride. "This is for you, Joanne," Aria said quietly, her voice choked with emotion. "You've inspired so many people. This center will be a place where others can receive the same compassion and care you've given to everyone you've touched." Joan could feel tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She took Aria's hands, unable to find words for the gratitude she felt. The center would be a lasting legacy, a place that would serve the community she had devoted her life to, a place where people could find the support and kindness she had once struggled to find. After the ceremony, Joanne and Aria walked around the room, greeting attendees and hearing stories from those whose lives they had impacted. They met young nurses who had received scholarships, patients who had been touched by Joan's care, and students inspired by Aria's transformation. The energy in the room was electric, and Joan felt the weight of all that had led her to this point, the trials and challenges, the moments of doubt and resilience. As the night wore on, they found themselves on the balcony, gazing out over the city lights, the cool autumn breeze carrying the scent of falling leaves. They stood in silence, each lost in their thoughts, until Aria spoke, her voice soft. "I sometimes wonder what my life would have looked like if that night at La Belle Maison had gone differently," she said, her tone reflective. "If you hadn't been there, if I had left that restaurant without seeing myself for who I really was." Joanne turned to her, her expression thoughtful. "I believe we all have those moments, moments that test us, that give us the chance to be better. Sometimes it just takes someone holding up that mirror, showing us what we're capable of, for better or worse." Aria nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. "You showed me that I could be more, Joanne. I'll never forget that." They stood together in quiet contemplation, their friendship a testament to the power of growth and forgiveness. Each of them had come to understand that life was not about avoiding mistakes, but about how one chose to respond to them. They had both learned to embrace their flaws, to use them as stepping stones toward a more purposeful life. In the years that followed, the Joanne Carter Center for Community Health became a beacon of hope for the community, offering free health services, educational programs, and support for those in need. Joanne worked there part-time, balancing her role at the hospital with her commitment to the center. She found joy in mentoring young healthcare workers and saw in them the same passion and drive that had once fueled her own journey. Aria remained deeply involved, often visiting the center to meet with students and patients, her hands-on approach inspiring others to give back. She continued to support scholarships, expanding her outreach to include programs for women entering other fields of service. Her name, once synonymous with wealth and privilege, had become associated with kindness and generosity. Their paths continued to intersect, their lives woven together by a shared commitment to leaving the world better than they had found it. And though the road had not been easy, they had each found a way to rise above their past, to redefine themselves, and to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. Together, they had created a legacy of kindness, a legacy that would live on in the hearts of those they had helped, in the hands of every nurse who walked through the doors of the community health center, and in the lives of everyone who, through their example, came to understand that compassion was the truest measure of strength.